Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first session of our WebAIM Digital Accessibility Series. I'm Ryan Roush, Training and Technical Assistance Lead at the Association of Assistive Technology Act Programs AT3 Center. As an occupational therapist by training, I have many years of helping people participate in what matters most to them. In today's world, that participation increasingly depends on digital accessibility, ensuring everyone can engage meaningfully with web and mobile app content. When we prioritize digital accessibility from the start, everyone benefits. And to help us understand how to make this happen, we're honored to have Rob Carr, Strategic Accessibility Coordinator at WebAIM, as our presenter. Rob brings extensive experience in digital accessibility since 2010 and has worked with numerous organizations on implementing accessibility solutions. But before we begin, are you guys looking for some continuing education units or proof that you attended? Please complete our end of the session survey that will pop up when you exit today's webinar. Check your browser window to locate it. This is your ticket to receiving a certificate of attendance. We'll also send the survey link by email afterward. And if you're still having trouble accessing the survey and want a certificate, please reach out to Jamie Anderson. I'll put her email in the chat here in a moment. One more important update. We're moving to an improved Zoom platform called Webinars Plus, which requires new registration links for all remaining sessions. However, don't worry, we'll automatically register you for all 5 remaining sessions. This change will happen within the month, so please delete any calendar appointments you saved with the old links and watch for the new links in your email. Now, I'm pleased to turn things over to Rob Carr to discuss leadership commitment and influencer participation in digital accessibility. Rob, take it away.
Ryan, thanks. Sorry again about the bit of confusion. Glad we can go ahead and get started, though. This is a bit of a full circle moment for me. I worked 8.5 years at Oklahoma's Assistive Technology Act program called AbleTech. And when the team from ATAP reached out and said, "Hey, would you be interested in coming in to contribute to this conversation?" I was like, "Yes, absolutely. That would be a blast." And so I'm really thrilled to have the opportunity and look forward to this and the rest of the series. Like Ryan said, I've been doing web accessibility work for quite a while now. It'll be just pushing 16 years next month. And other than the 8.5 years that I've been with AbleTech, for about the last 4, I've been with WebAIM. If you're not familiar with WebAIM, we are a nonprofit web and digital accessibility group that's based at Utah State University. So we're a little bit different because we live in the public sector. We keep our lights on and fund some of the research activities that we do, though, by providing training and evaluation on a really technical level, as well as consultation, both technical and more like what I'm going to get into today and through the rest of the series, which is looking more at organizational behavior and accessibility. And we're going to start this off, like Ryan indicated, by really digging into the need and the reason to have active leadership and to consider who needs to be a part of this conversation within our organizations. As I'm going through, I welcome questions either in the chat, ideally in the Q&A. It's a little bit easier to follow questions as they come in through the Q&A, but I know sometimes they naturally find their way into the chat as well. But I'll try to keep an eye out for questions coming in regardless of which of those sources, and I will pause periodically to see what kind of questions or comments you have. Let me go ahead and get some slides going here. What's a presentation without sharing slides? And we will get on with it from here. So when we're thinking about building out a sustainable accessibility effort, when we are thinking about what to do to abide by some of the new regulations that are out there, I think that it's important to think about it big picture. I will try to bring this back to if you're not in a position where you can really reach out to senior leadership, that's often not something that people are positioned very well to do. I'm going to mention some things to think about that you can do at the local level, particularly in some of the later sessions. I will try to circle back with some of those thoughts here throughout our time today. So as we get into this, I want to refer to something that I actually inherited. This is not work that I started, but this is work that I inherited and had actually followed for a while when I joined WebAIM. This is a strategic accessibility framework that what I'm going to talk about today derives from, what most of what I will speak about over the duration of this series derives from. Let me just drop a link into the chat to make it a little bit easier for y'all. There's a fair amount to this, I admit, but if you want to get an idea of where we're going with this conversation, this will do that, and also I think serve as a good reference as you want to refer back and maybe dig a little bit deeper into some of the things that I touch on in the time that we have together over the next year. And as this establishes a commitment from leadership is really foundational. It's kind of the first big indicator that we have for a successful accessibility program. And that's really where this work derives from, is looking at what are organizations and entities doing that makes their accessibility work actually work and make it effective. We'll go on and talk about planning and implementation, required resources. We'll touch on some assessment pieces later on in the series. And then I know that our final session is dedicated to discussing a little bit about language learning models slash AI and accessibility. And we're going to hone in more specifically on what that content looks like over the next couple of weeks or so. But I just want to leave this with you as a reference to fall back on and to refer back to. And as I said, to maybe dig more into some of these things that we'll talk about throughout this series. And I have a question for you all, and I'll just ask you to put your thoughts into the chat. The question that I want to pose is, in your organization, who is responsible for digital accessibility? Now, your first instinct is likely correct to say everybody, right? No, exactly. You are exactly right. The way I want to think about this is through a little bit more narrow focus, though. And I want you to think of a web product. And that term I use pretty broadly. It can be your public-facing website, it could be a mobile app. Think of one web product that you serve up. And then I want you to think through who are the people that influence the creation of that thing, the selection of a third-party tool. So think about this a little bit more narrowly. Again, anyone who typed in a couple typed everyone, and you are exactly right. But I want you to think about it a little bit more specifically. I'll give you another minute or so, and then I'll recap some of the responses in the chat. And I might add some gaps here who come up, getting some good responses about who is a part of this. And Angela, I appreciate consumers. I'm going to talk about that as well. We've got IT, yes. Operations manager, yes. Web dev, web developer, absolutely. IT and procurement, comms and marketing, accessibility coordinator and content owners, editors, content creators and publishers. We've got IT, media training coordinator, PIO, public information officer, IT, again, ditto with support from EdTech and AT. I'm going to talk a little bit about the educational space in particular. A really good list, resource center manager. Grant requirements also are a big influencer. That's a really good point, Angela, especially I feel like in this day and time. Those grant requirements are a big influencer in a lot of different ways. Marketing, IT, and faculty. Thank you all for contributing. Alan, you got leadership. Yes, absolutely. QA and compliance, who are built into or having built-in processes and procedures. Mary mentioned audience. I think you all have covered everybody who I'm going to go through and itemize in the next slide. Rachel, you mentioned you've also got a team, a digital accessibility team with IT, content creators, professors and faculty, your AT Act program staff. Fantastic list. And I hope that this exercise is helpful in actually being a little bit more narrow. But what I think we have discovered is that by focusing a little bit more narrowly on one thing, our list of people is a lot bigger and more specific. And that's kind of the point of this exercise, is to think through this in such a way that we have a much more specific idea of the people who influence accessibility, whether that's directly or not. And so I've itemized some of these, and I'll talk a little bit about a specific effort within a lot of entities. Many of you may have been through a website redesign within your entity. So thinking about that process and the final product, A lot of the folks you all are a part of this. Leadership with governance, with policy, and approval for funding. A lot of the time, leadership, even at the highest level, has to understand if we're going to build a new website, that often means that we are taking not just the website to a new place as far as its design and the way people interact with it, but we're often also putting it onto a new platform. And leadership at the highest levels understands this is going to be a disruption. And we need to make sure that we account for that disruption. What's it going to disrupt? It's going to disrupt the timeline for putting new content out to the existing site. Often there will be a cutoff, and we'll say, however many weeks out, we're not going to publish new content to our current site. We're going to devote that time to learning how to use the next thing that's coming and really polish those skills and kind of get content queued up, but not go out onto the new site or the existing site because we want to invest that time into the new one. Myriad other ways that leadership significantly influences and can either contribute to accessibility as a part of that conversation in this context or can inhibit our work with accessibility. Marketing and brand management, I think, marketing and comms was mentioned. They carry through, especially in a project like this, a lot of direct influence. In my experience, marketing and comms is really front and center in these conversations. They're very directly involved. Information security and data privacy is a group that's really heavily involved in a conversation about a website redesign, often directly, almost always through policy, especially if the site has much in the way of interaction where people are filling out forms. The bar for having sensitive or private information is not very high. I think we think about making sure we account for the way that we take social security numbers or financial information, but the information people give us doesn't have to be that sensitive to still be sensitive. So there's often that direct influence. Of course, we have our designers, the web team, IT, a lot of people mentioned because they have so much in terms of government and governance and such and policy. And then, as other folks mentioned, content contributors and that target audience is just absolutely critical to our thinking and should be. And within that target audience, we have people with disabilities. And that's true whether it's a public facing website or it is a site that might have a narrower focus and a little bit more narrow audience, still very much a part of the conversation. And I see that there is a question. I'll take a look at this. Thank you, Crystal. Regs require colleges to provide the exact URL for student consumer information. Title II requires short descriptive links. They seem to be in conflict. Crystal, that's an excellent question that I do not have an answer to because I don't know which regulations are coming out for the precise URL. What I would say to potentially work around that is to provide in your text. And this is getting a little bit more into some of the technical aspects of accessibility. I'm fine with that as long as you all are okay with this side journey. The way I would approach this is the first thought that I have about it, is to make the interactive part the descriptive link text. And then maybe you make just a parenthetical note with the website address. I think you could make either one of those active links. It depends somewhat to the length or somewhat on the length of the actual URL. But my approach to it would be to follow accessibility guidelines that are codified in the ADA now and have the descriptive link text that is an active link. And then as a parenthetical, note the actual URL. So that's my first thought. I don't know if others have dealt with that and want to put their thoughts into the chat. Not necessarily maybe as in opposition as it seems. I think that we might be able to abide by both, even if it does take up more real estate. And that's kind of a concern with the requirement for the URLs to begin with, when sometimes the URLs, the website addresses are a bit unruly. So thank you for that question. I appreciate it. Stacy, you say you've done the same. That's my first thought about navigating that. But there is a broader point where sometimes we do feel like the legal guidance that we get is in opposition, and we have to think maybe a little more creatively about can we abide by both, and if so, then what are some ways to do that? I know there are educators who are here. We had mention of educational context, and particularly in educational technology. I would say that our list includes most of the people on the last slide. Even when you're thinking about building out a course within a learning management system, whether you're in K through 12 or post-secondary ed, you're going to have marketing and branding influence. You're going to have policy influence. but you're also going to have a more specific group of contributors. Your curriculum committee, if you have a statewide curriculum committee in K-12, they're making decisions and recommending vendors who often do offer very rich digital experiences. And ideally, at that state level, the curriculum committee, textbook committee, whatever they might be called, are accounting for accessibility. So when they either mandate things and say, these are the curricular pieces that you can put into the classroom, or they're just making recommendations, accessibility is built into that process. Others mentioned teachers and instructors thinking about the target audience, your students in the academic setting. For schools, whether it's K-12 again or higher education, it isn't only about students. And I didn't put parents and guardians on the list, but that's very much a part of this target audience. Also, program participants. My oldest is a talented musician. He rehearses constantly. He's a junior in high school, and this week he's working like a 60-hour week and not getting paid for any of it, but he's rehearsing a bunch. They've got a musical he's playing in coming up. They have state band contest. Our schools open our doors to members of the public regularly, and we publish where the events are, the time. If we have tickets, those are often for sale or otherwise available through our web presence. So it's not just our students or our parents or guardians or even family members, it's members of the community. And I would say too that when we think about general education concerns with accessibility, special education is a voice that needs to be heard. I would maintain that special ed can't be the ones leading this conversation in K through 12. I think that it's a critical voice to have, but these are educational technology and general education questions. Point of all of this being is that we have really complex systems with a lot of contributors, a lot of influencers from across our organizations. The systems that we have in place that include people and processes and tools and timelines and all of the things that go into it build and create and put our technology tools out to our different target audiences. What I think I can say based on a lot of experience in not just evaluating web properties, but also in talking to people across education, non-education, large tech firms, really across the board, is that our systems are often not very well informed about accessibility. And what I have illustrated here is one large arrow that's pointed to the right that, in my mind, really illustrates the momentum that our systems have. And facing in opposition to this big yellow arrow are a bunch of smaller arrows, which represent, in my mind, those of us who are advocating for accessibility, particularly when it's just from the grassroots. What we need to have is systems be much better informed about accessibility. That's the goal. Our systems need to change so that they understand and comprehend accessibility at multiple levels. So when we think about all of those people that we discussed who influence accessibility, and really the question is, I think, more general, it's who influences the technologies that we provide. We need to have those big systems and those people, processes, et cetera, aligned with those of us who are advocating for accessibility. And one of the biggest changes, and what we've seen from the WebAIM side, I also work 30% for a technical assistance center funded by the Department of Education at the federal level. What we see is that there's still a lot of reactionary approaches to digital accessibility. Some of that is, I think, a result of the systems not being well informed about accessibility, but particularly in K-12, there's a big shift happening. But even if you're in public higher education, where typically digital accessibility has been discussed a lot more, if you're in a state agency, you work with a federal agency where accessibility has been in the conversation more often. What we're being asked to do is what we really have been asked to do. I think there's just a greater realization that we need to be proactive with accessibility from the very beginning, that accessibility is something that we need to account for from the start, whether we're building something entirely on our own or we are purchasing something from an outside vendor, using something that's free or low cost, or a combination of those. Because a lot of the time we're purchasing a platform like a learning management system for the classroom environment or a content management system for the web environment, and it's a combination of both. And we have to act much more proactively across our organizations and entities to make this a proactive effort as opposed to reacting based on an individual's needs when it comes to accessibility. Before I get more into and speak more directly to the need for leadership to be actively leading on this, A couple of big picture thoughts. I think I've illustrated that it's really important for this to be an organization-wide effort. I've seen groups try to kind of centralize accessibility in one shop, not just from a coordination perspective. One of the things specifically I've seen groups try to do is basically hand the responsibility for accessibility in PDFs, which, especially in the public sector, they account for a large percentage of our web content, and try to centralize that and say, we're not going to worry about what those documents and flyers and such look like once they get to this office. This office is just going to fix everything. That is definitely a bottleneck in waiting. And that is something that's probably going to run people away from that particular bottleneck because they're never going to be able to keep up. It's not just PDFs. I'm not picking on PDFs. I say with relative regularity that the lack of accessibility in PDF content isn't strictly the format's fault. There's a lot about education and training upstream and authoring tools. But I use that example just to illustrate that when we try to put accessibility on one person to just take care of, on one department to just take care of, it usually doesn't work. We need to those who said everyone in response to the question about who's responsible. We need everybody to understand that responsibility, and we need organizations to build the scaffolding out for us so they can follow through. The last big picture point that I'll make before getting a little bit more specific is that this is often a culture change. As I said, I think it's a bigger one for K-12, but this is a shift in understanding how we meet the needs of people with disabilities who engage with us digitally. We're so used to reacting to those needs with individual accommodations that thoughts of acting ahead of time in the digital space, it's still something that a lot of folks in leadership don't really think about, and they're the ones who set the culture. And that really reinforces the need for active facilitation from leadership to make this happen. The way we phrased it at WebAIM for a long time, and as I've said, I've inherited quite a bit of this, is that we need vision and commitment from leadership. We need the vision from across the board in order to understand where the organization needs to go. And we need an active commitment. Without that active commitment, we don't see the kind of facilitation. We don't see investment in planning that we need. And all too often, I work with people who have been told, yes, we support you doing that, but it's a very passive kind of support. And there's not that active facilitation. There's not a vision formed. There's not a culture shift. It's often one or a few people who are very passionate about accessibility who kind of get the blessing to do stuff with it, but find that they can only go so far. And that's why when we talk about why the commitment is so important, it's several things, right? If we get one person who's at a senior level of leadership, they're in a better position to be able to reach out to their peer leaders and say, hey, I need help with this. I can't do this even within, my broader focus of leadership. I can't do this just within my part of the organization because of all of the interconnected influences that we talked about. Leadership establishes priorities and facilitates work, establishes the culture. And it's really, really critical then that leadership, not just one, but at least a handful of our leadership group is actively championing this work. And one of the things that I've observed over the years as well is that if you have really one executive champion in leadership, but they go to another organization, this becomes more brittle, or that brittle nature is exposed, is maybe a better way to say it. Those changes in leadership are less harsh to an accessibility effort if there's already a bit of a critical mass within your senior leadership team in advancing accessibility and facilitating that so that those of you who are working from the grassroots level don't find a really low ceiling. So we talked more generally about kind of the operational side. I think we're going to find some overlap in that conversation and in this one. When we think about the key leadership folks, the thought leaders and influencers, I want to pose another question to you all to put your thoughts in the chat. It's going to derive from the list that we created before, but this is getting now more to specific leadership roles within your organization. Another just chat storm in Zoom. Who are the leaders? I wouldn't mention them by name because they might not really know they're responsible for this. So I guess it's really what are the leadership roles that you would say are critical to moving accessibility forward within your organization? So we'll do the same thing as on the previous question, just a chat storm. Put those roles into the chat and I'll recap as they're coming through. And I'll give you all a couple of minutes to think about that. your VPs, your executive VPs. If you're in higher ed, you've got associate and assistant VPs, chief technology officer, director of IT, director of AT, vice president, CEO, directors across the board, executive director, director of field operations, entire leadership team. That's the ideal, right? I think that that is the ideal to have the entire leadership team advocating for this. It's a bit of a stretch. I haven't seen that work a ton, but that I think is a goal. We've got president, VP, provost in an educational environment, directors again of IT and AT, marketing leaders, directors, accessibility staff, professional development. I think that's a really big component of this, making sure that the people who are facilitating or creating professional development in HR, in human resources, are also leading on this for any of a number of reasons. Somebody from university, top down, compliance and procurement. I think your compliance people are going to necessarily be a part of this, whether they're coming from legal. Usually, legal is somewhere adjacent to or involved with compliance. Comms, internal comms, HR, and IT. Yes, a cross-functional group working through leadership at that level. ADA coordinator, um, OCR education specialists, curriculum coaches at the city level. Although, so this is good. I appreciate this, Alan. The mayor, the executive team, departmental leads. I don't know where city councils fit into your municipality. That tends to vary a little bit. It doesn't hurt for city council members to have some understanding of this responsibility at the city level as well. James, you get into selling the idea that it's good business. People who have a good experience with the website will be loyal and tell their friends. It's very true. I'm going to talk about some of the business cases that we might think about making later on. Lindsay, you make a really good point. People who do technical work, it's not just technical work, it's people who create PowerPoint slides and create flyers with the different tools that are out there. Anyone who creates stuff really should be taught how to do it in whatever educational setting they come from, whether that is higher education, 2 year or 4 year, if they go to more of a trade school for higher education. We do need more on the educational side. And that in turn takes educational leadership at all levels to identify where that curriculum needs to change, et cetera, et cetera. Joey, to make the point, influencers are important. So it's not just compliance, but making life better for parents and students. The why is part of the influential message there. Digital accessibility team includes a good leadership team, but would ideally include deans, provost, president. Fantastic list. I'm going to skip the next slide, honestly, because we've covered it. The one group that I might, or the one role that I might mention for those of you who are in the public sector, your ADA coordinator or Title IX admin, those are often the same person wearing two hats. I think it's really critical for them to be a part of this conversation as well. We talked about AR, we talked about or HR, we talked about a lot of these folks. Again, where you have people with disabilities in these roles, really critical for those voices to be a part of the conversation as well. I can't thank you all enough for your activity in the chat. Even with a larger group, we're at around 140 participants. Often the chat storm is it's a very small storm that doesn't really have much thunder. I really appreciate your thinking and contributing to the conversation. What I'm quietly doing here is suggesting forming a steering committee that does include at least appointments from senior leadership. As I've alluded to, you may not have the reach to be able to pull that off. But when we think about where organizations start in particular, what I've observed over the years and what I recommend now is bringing together this steering committee of human beings to bring voices in and thoughts in who understand and can contribute to a conversation about the different influences that come from the organization, that understand the way that they influence and the way their groups are influenced by a bunch of the things that we've thought through. The policies, the direct participation in conversations and decision making. There are just so many interconnected things that we really do want to pull together a group of people who have broad perspective across the organization and at least some pretty specific understanding of what, again, their influences are and how they provide influence to others within the organization. I think that having a standing steering committee, particularly if you're in, a medium to large entity, but even if you're in a small one who does a lot with digital, where you can pull together these human beings, I think you're going to have a better experience, and you're going to have more information to align things and to understand where accessibility fits. Ideally, when you think about this recurring theme here, it's best for leadership to send a formal request for people to participate. It's not necessarily required, but it is, I think, generally a more effective way to make sure that those critical voices are at the table, whether they're using their voices or they are using text to speech. Those people need to be directly involved. Often that will be delegated. If it's delegated too much, it might slow the effort down a little bit. It might keep people from being able to take recommendations or make recommendations and really follow through with them and make them happen. Where there's delegation, if the responsibility of whoever is delegated into that conversation aligns with some authority, in other words, if you have a VP, you have somebody at senior leadership, and they delegate that participation to someone, does the someone they delegate that to uh, come with the authority to be able to make sure that when recommendations are carried forward to the group, that you can actually act on them and they don't have to go back to their leadership and say, well, I have to make sure that I can say yes or no to this. You want your thought leaders as a part of this as well. Leadership, and many of you might know this or have observed this, leadership can be formal and it can also be very informal. So when we think about leadership, it isn't just the people who have formal leadership roles, it's people who are thought leaders within our organizations, and it's people who know the organization really well. I think most of us know of at least a few people who have been there for a while or they've just established really good relationships. That's a really strong skill set, and they have a lot of insight into how the organization work. And that group that you pull together, steering committee, task force, whatever you might call it, is often there to shape and review deliverables that might pop up from more focused groups. The idea with a steering committee, whatever this might be, is that it's there as maybe a standing group. And I would say that even if you get to a point where you find a way to allocate funds to have somebody as a coordinator for digital accessibility within your entity, it still is a very good idea, in my experience, to have a steering committee for that human being to work with because they are not likely to be able to get all of the different perspectives on their own, or at least it's going to take a lot more work. And they might find that they can't get into the meetings they need to be a part of. The steering committee can be really instrumental. One of the other things that often happens is you have a steering committee that is comprised of those leadership or designees, but you'll find that as that group has conversations, they identify specific tasks. And sometimes those tasks need a different group of specialists. So when we think about the steering committee or the group of thought leaders, typically, as I've suggested, really broad coverage from across your entity, from across your organization, there to review work, maybe to initiate or help to identify projects and work, but really to review work, review recommendations that some of these smaller task forces might focus on and provide guidance and feedback to them and to pave the trail, to help to make sure that again, the work has some facilitators at a high level. And that might mean that members of the steering committee are managing up. If they have been delegated from a senior member of leadership to be a part of this group, then much of their responsibility might be working with that senior leader to say, okay, here's what's coming in. We really need you to engage this and to either advocate for reasonable changes to provide constructive criticism or to advocate for it to peer leaders as it is, so that this does have broad-based support. I think about things like accessibility policies. We'll talk about accessibility policies here in a session or two. Those are the kinds of specific tasks that another group might work on more at that task force level and push through and run through the steering committee for at least initial approval or feedback on a draft to anticipate some bumps in the road that a first draft might face. Those task forces, as I just mentioned, are going to focus more narrowly on things like policy authoring, implementation planning, resource planning, communication planning. Many of the things that we'll focus on in the rest of the series, you'll often find that a task force spawns and really focuses on these things on its own, working with that steering committee or that group of thought leaders. So they're going to receive feedback, they're going to receive guidance, and really try to follow the trail that the steering committee is creating for them. And you are very likely to have more than one based on the topical area of focus. The people who are involved with policy might not necessarily need to be, at least in full, involved in a conversation about implementation planning to meet that policy. You might have more direct involvement in a policy conversation from your policy and legal folks. When it comes to implementation planning, that's more how do we do what our policy says we're going to do? And that may involve a different group of people, or at least switching some folks out to focus a little bit more narrowly on that piece. Some of the common tasks that you might find a group coming up with, I just mentioned policy drafting. Gap analysis is a big part of this. A lot of the time, I get to work with entities who are really early on in addressing accessibility at that enterprise organizational level. And one of the first things that I usually do is work with them on a self-assessment and identify what are we doing with accessibility? Where does that reside? And what aren't we doing? What within, say, we have kind of the general puzzle pieces that you might need to put together a good, sustainable effort. Yeah, that's great if we have the puzzle pieces, but one organization will be able to put those together in a different order than another. One may not have that many puzzle pieces. They might have a 50-piece puzzle where a larger organization or a group that has a lot more going on with technology, well, they might have a 100 or 500-piece puzzle. So that gap analysis and identifying where there are gaps and opportunities, I think is a really critical step. That steering committee can be really influential in contributing to that and in pulling together others to contribute to that kind of effort. I mentioned implementation planning and then just more generally thinking about what kind of projects we need to pull together to get from where we are to where we need to be. There are a lot of distinct projects that will have a start date and a desired end date with a desired deliverable. Overall, the projects are in service of this sustainable accessibility program that is an ongoing thing. For it to really work, it needs to be an ongoing thing. And then prioritization of projects is also an important aspect of the steering committee's work to a significant extent. But also with these different task forces, sometimes there becomes clear that we need to have something like policy in place before we can really start building out an implementation plan. So maybe there's a bit of a dependency there that the steering committee will contribute to helping to identify, but it's liable to come up as some of these more focused projects are under initiation and get underway. I want to stop there. I'll talk about some of the business case that we saw come up in the chat. I do want to pause and see what questions you all have before I get into some of the themes to consider as you're advocating to your boss, to whoever you can. Maybe it's you're advocating to your team to look at accessibility a little bit more comprehensively. But I do want to open the door to some questions based on what I've talked about so far. And I know it takes a moment. I still wish Zoom would show when people are typing. That's one feature that I wish Zoom would put in place. If my phone can do it in my texting app, I think Zoom can pull it off, but we're not there yet. So I'll keep an eye out and see if anything comes up. I've got chat in the Q&A here. Um, my question, Joan, is what questions do you all have? Opening it up to the floor to see what questions y'all have. Yeah, for once, I'm not asking for answers or thoughts from you. I'm asking from y'all what questions you might have. So I'll move on and I will keep an eye out for things that come in. Um, I want to move on to communicating the vision because that is a challenge. And that's a challenge whether it's you talking to your boss directly about why, when you're in PowerPoint, you need to create more accessible slides. Just one example, right? But there are a lot of things that are very local to our work where we have a very direct influence over accessibility and we need some help. We need some training. We need maybe some reference materials. We just need to know where to go with questions within our organization. Then also communicating this vision is important for leadership as well. I think we can scale this all the way up to if you are in senior leadership, hopefully some of these things will resonate with you. If you're trying to communicate with peers in leadership, hopefully some of these things will resonate with your peers. I do think, though, that it's important for us to have a few messages in mind when we're trying to articulate why this is an important thing to focus on at this bigger, grander scale, maybe than what a lot of people in leadership and elsewhere within our organizations might think is appropriate. And the first one I'll start out with is the impact on human beings. I've got a picture here of somebody using a refreshable Braille display. For those who aren't familiar with assistive technology, this dynamically changes what is built into the web when it's accessible into Braille code. And so one line at a time, somebody who knows Braille can read across and then go to the next line. It can also send some keyboard commands, which is another accessibility piece. There's a big significant component of accessibility around our digital stuff needs to react in expected ways when people are using a keyboard or a device like a Braille display. In our work at WebAIM, when we're doing technical evaluation work, even, we still are focused on human beings and we put things through or into that context of, hey, look, we need to think about impact on humans. And that's how we should establish, or at least that's one of the variables we need to establish a priority for suggesting fixes, is what is the negative impact on someone who is trying to use the thing, whatever it might be. And this is going to come up as we go. And there's an important consideration here too. These are not mutually exclusive. A lot of these do work with one another, and I'll illustrate and describe that a little bit as we go. But this impact on humans piece is one that I think it tends to resonate with people, particularly with people who are working at the operational level, your educators, your designers, your developers, people who are building and designing the things. This might be something that resonates a little bit better. But just one particular piece. There's another question that's come in. I'll circle back to it here in a moment because it's a really good question with some kind of potentially uh, uh, challenging considerations. And I'll try to tease some of that out here in a few minutes. I think that we need to reconsider the relationship between accessibility and our colleagues who do data privacy and security work. And that's because historically, there's a fair amount of tension there. Tension arising from things like using things like CAPTCHA in form submissions, making that a requirement for somebody to submit a form. From the accessibility perspective, and we know this from our screen reader user survey that we do, we're actually just getting underway to get that in front of the review board at Utah State University. We should be issuing a new screen reader user survey in the next few weeks. We've been doing this for, gosh, over 10 years. We do one about every 18 months or so consistently since CAPTCHA has existed, it's been one of the biggest pains in the rears of people who use screen readers. They are often functionally accessible, but they're often very hard to use when you use a screen reader. And that's a really good example of a place where there is tension between those of us who work in accessibility and those who work on the security side. I think we need to figure out some ways to resolve that tension because really, to think about this another way, if you have accessibility as a circle in a Venn diagram, you have privacy and security as another circle, they overlap a lot. I don't know if the Venn diagram is just a circle. It's really close, and I'll illustrate a way that that's the case. If you have somebody who has a mobile app and the login for the mobile app is just not accessible, TalkBack, iOS, or VoiceOver on mobile iOS, they don't work at all with this login. Well, yes, somebody may well reach out to you if you're responsible for serving that app out. But a lot of the times, people are going to ask, a trusted household member or a friend to insert their login information. That is absolutely a security vulnerability, right? Even trusted household members can still maybe use that information in not great ways. Friends and colleagues can ask that information in not great ways. I remember a lawsuit years ago now, and it didn't involve digital, it involved point of sale terminals where you go up and you can put your debit card in and you have to insert a PIN. And they, at this point in time, I think on the number five, they have a little raised dot. It's like you find on your keyboard, the J and F keys have a tactile little nubbin on them so you can orient your hands to the keyboard. In this case, with those point of sale terminals, is so you can orient your hand to the keypad so you can input a PIN. And I remember a lawsuit, I don't remember the retailer, but the lawsuit, as I recall, derived from somebody trying to pay someone for a pair of pants, say. And what they found, they were blind, and what they found was that there was no way to orient their hand. The clerk said, "Well, just tell me your PIN." that's inherently a security issue in a different context, but the same kinds of things often happen. I think that a reason we should build this relationship is because your privacy and security people often have a greater reach already. They often have governance and policy in place. We can learn lessons from how they pulled that off. They can become advocates. If we illustrate to them that inaccessibility leads to breaches in privacy and leads to breaches in sharing of sensitive information that they would be very uncomfortable with, we may be able to build some very important relationships and advocates that way. At the operational level, I think we can make a really good case and illustrate that if we account for accessibility from the start, we will be much more efficient. If you think about this in the purchasing process, kind of the worst case scenario is accessibility comes up after a contract's signed. And at that point, you're in a really difficult situation as an organization because likely there's not anything about accessibility in your contract. There's likely not anything about accessibility written anywhere. And that can be really, really problematic. So putting ourselves in a position where we account for it from literally the beginning makes it much more efficient and we don't have the rework. It's the same with designing and building things. Accounting for accessibility up front saves a ton of time in trying to remediate after the fact or in having to go back and do rework, and those are often one in the same.
Rob, we have a question in the Q&A.
Yeah, and I mentioned it earlier. I'll come back around
Okay,
to it because it's a little
awesome.
bit out of context here, but I do want to
Yeah.
come back to it because it is a really good question about how to influence folks who are outside the organization even further. And maybe some of these messages will help from that attendee. There's not a name there, but maybe how we move this question forward with some of the people who are in that setting where you've got speakers that you're trying to bring in. This is a challenge, and I'll speak to this later when we put together our accessibility conference at WebAIM. It's always something that we have to reiterate, even though the speakers we invite are from the accessibility space. Another thing to look at, maybe not to your external speakers, but internally is a return on investment. And this is something most people think about as a return on financial investment. We invest in a tool. What do we get back? We create a more accessible experience. What's our return? You can Google and find some numbers about that. You can find more information about maybe the spending capacity that people with disabilities have. There's the financial return. There's also the return on investment as far as the organization's reputation. And look, we're investing in digital accessibility. You have groups like Microsoft that have been really public about the work that they've done in advancing accessibility across their different product lines, and even going so far as to really reach more into trying to contribute to answering the question, how do we improve employment for people with disabilities, not just in their own hiring practices, but how can they influence others as well? So ROI is not just a financial consideration. Sometimes it's about reputation, which also factors into thinking about mission, vision, and values. A lot of us get to work for very mission-driven entities, and the consideration of what your stated mission is, your internally held vision and values, those are things that you might be able to build advocacy or advocate successfully to your leadership because they may well buy into the mission, vision, and values that you put out there as an organization. I think another thing to consider is the overall quality. And I've gotten maybe more sensitive to broadening the conversation about accessibility too much to, oh, look, there are all these other general benefits. It's like the curb cut effect, but in a virtual space. That's valid. I tend to focus more on, look, accessibility is because disabled people frequently face discrimination in all kinds of shapes and sizes. But there is, you can observe at least a correlation in accessibility and a focus on accessibility and a better overall experience. And I think that derives from people focusing on accessibility are also focusing on human beings, the human beings who interact with the things that they create. So I think when we appeal to people's desire to create a quality experience, we can fold accessibility into one of those measures relatively easily. A couple of others, risk management is very much a part of this. That's going to appeal to your legal counsel, your compliance shop. I think entirely leaning on risk management can paint you into a corner where it becomes more of a checkbox exercise, more of what do we need to do minimally to clear the risk hurdles that we might have. But I do still think it's valid with some members of the leadership team who are more focused on organizational risk, particularly in the legal environment that we are in now. And then derived out of that is civil rights. In civil rights, yes, we have a legal environment around civil rights, but to kind of circle back to the human element, the civil rights laws that we have are there because of the discrimination that people have faced well, from the very beginning of time. In the virtual space, also from the beginning of the internet, really. Once the internet especially became more sophisticated, as people had to work around the less sophisticated, pardon me, the less sophisticated internet of the early 2000s, there have been barriers to access from the very beginning. So the civil rights piece, I think, brings together a lot of the concepts that I've talked about as far as trying to justify building a program out to leadership and to peers. I think it's a good way to really capture several of the things that I talked about. Um, we're running low on time. I do want to open this up to other questions that you all might have, and I will get to the question posted in the Q&A. You work in student life and campus engagement. When you're contracting keynote speakers for programming in your leadership series, should we require the presenters provide digitally accessible content and explicitly place requirements in their contracts? To answer the question, should, I would say yes. Also, I've been an advocate in this space for almost 16 years, so I'm heavily biased toward pushing things in that direction. There are practical considerations there where if people are coming in from outside of the accessibility space, how do you get them to do it, right? And I know some of the events that I work with point to resources that we have on the WebAIM site about accessibility in PowerPoint. The World Wide Web Consortium has some good resources on not just accessibility in your materials, also accessibility in your presentation. That's another piece of this puzzle. Most of the images I've used, particularly over this last set of slides, don't convey a lot of meaning. They're to reinforce visually things that I'm talking about. But there are images that I've described because I feel like they do convey meaning. And those are practices that are difficult to get in the habit of. They do literally take practice. So while I think it makes sense to ask for it, I think the extended questions internally are going to be about how do we enforce it? Hopefully with keynotes, it's not a ton of speakers. But if you are, particularly in the current regulatory environment, if you're streaming this to your different community audience members virtually, then you bring in a lot of what's in the ADA now, right? Because you are streaming something via the web. So there are considerations. I would talk to your legal about it and see. It seems to me like there is a responsibility to address it somehow. As I said, from the practical side, I feel like it's hard enough for us to get our internal audience members to address accessibility, much less those who are coming in from outside. And then the question becomes, how do we deal with that? If others have thoughts, I welcome you to put them in the chat. I do believe we've just got a couple more minutes, but I want to let you all type other questions into Q&A or chat. I appreciate again, the conversation that you've contributed to, and I just want to, take advantage of the last bit of time and see what other questions you might have. And I see a comment about the Purchase Accessible Learning Materials Initiative. I don't remember if that was under the AIM Center or not. That Christopher, I don't know if Christopher's still on. But I do know that with the TA Center that we are working on, we're producing more about accessibility and procurement. It is an extension of some of that work from the Department of Education. So if you go to ENCADEMI or academy.org, you'll be able to get plugged into some of the work that we currently have out there regarding procurement, and really keep an eye on that space. We are working actively on providing more resources about the bigger picture of accessibility and procurement in the educational space, also some of the nuts and bolts as well. Ryan, thanks for dropping that in the chat. I appreciate it. We're just about at time. I see there's a question about the recording being shared. I just want to say again, thank you to ATAP and AT3 for inviting me in to be a part of this. Thank you to everyone who's participated. I hope that people will be able to jump into other sessions in the series. I'm really looking forward to it and just really appreciate your time and interest. And again, AT3, ATAP, I really sincerely appreciate being able to contribute to the conversation.
Yes, thank you, Rob. That was wonderful and amazing. Yes, please join us April 1st at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Rob will be coming back and talking about organizational policy and implementation planning. And again, just want to reiterate, we will be changing new platforms, and therefore the old registration you'll want to delete, and that email with the new registrations will be coming out within this next month. And yes, we will be posting the recording. It will be potentially posted to our website, but also our AT community. And again, I will put Jamie's contact in if you have any questions regarding um, today's session. And so, yeah, here is Jamie Anderson's email. And yeah, again, thank you all for joining. It's been a pleasure. And if you, again, yeah, have any questions, concerns, please reach out to Jamie and we can get, yeah, hope try to answer those things. So thank you all for a wonderful session. We look forward to seeing you. This is just the beginning. So excited to have five more. And thank you again to Rob Carr and WebAIM. Always a pleasure to work with you guys too. Likewise, thanks. Have a great day. Have a great afternoon. And hopefully it's a good Super Bowl. I don't know which teams you're going to be rooting for, but I was rooting for the Broncos, and unfortunately, they lost a couple weekends ago. So, have a great rest of your week. Oh, go Bills! Yeah, Josh Allen. Take care, guys.